Hey folks, in this edition of Tori's Top 10, we will be looking at Chapter 3 on paternalism and patient autonomy. Number 14. After reading the introduction to Chapter 3, you should understand what the morally relevant standards are that are at stake in relationships between patients and healthcare providers. The relationship between patients and healthcare providers brings up two really important moral standards. Healthcare providers, as professionals, have a duty of beneficence. The Hippocratic Oath requires healthcare providers to do no harm to their patients, but beyond non-maleficence, doing no harm, professional healthcare providers also have a duty of beneficence. At the same time, patients have a right for their autonomy to be respected. So we have, within the relationship of patients and healthcare providers, what often ends up to be conflicting values or duties. And this results in a number of moral issues in healthcare. So a lot of the issues that we will look at throughout the semester will involve, among other things, a conflict between a provider's duty of beneficence and a patient's right to autonomy. Which brings us to number 13. What is autonomy? As I've mentioned, the moral standard of autonomy is going to be really, really important in bioethics or medical ethics. This is a moral standard that's going to come up in nearly every issue that we discuss. Autonomy is the capacity that human beings have for self-governance. The capacity we have to make choices about our bodies and lives that are truly our own choices without overriding pressures or forces. The principle of autonomy, as I said, is fundamental in bioethics and healthcare. As long as a person is fully autonomous, they should be allowed to exercise their capacity for self-determination. That is, we should respect the autonomy of competent individuals. Number 12. What is beneficence? Beneficence is the moral standard that says we should treat others with care, do what's good for other people. But again, beneficence is not merely a restraint from harming others, it's the active doing of good to help others. Number 11. What is paternalism? Conflicts between a professional's duty of beneficence and a patient's right to autonomy often involve issues of paternalism. Paternalism is the action of overriding someone else's choices or actions for their own good. There are two different forms of paternalism, weak paternalism and strong paternalism, and the distinction is important. Weak paternalism occurs when you override or interfere in someone's choices or actions because they're not fully autonomous or they're not competent to make decisions. This is something that happens all of the time. If someone is incapacitated or unconscious or has a mental health issue and they are less than fully autonomous, it's typically okay for someone to step in and make decisions in their best interests. So we usually understand weak paternalism to be fairly unproblematic in the moral sense. Strong paternalism, on the other hand, is a form of paternalism where someone steps in and overrides another person's choices or actions, even though that person is considered to be fully autonomous. Number 10. Do patients have the right to refuse treatment? Well, this is one of the issues that results from a conflict between a healthcare provider's duty of beneficence and a patient's right to autonomy. Although paternalism, strong paternalism even, used to rule the day in the medical industry, patients' rights to autonomy are becoming more and more respected, both morally and legally. Today, a competent patient has the right to refuse treatment, even if that treatment is life-saving. This is not merely a moral standard, it's now a legal right, which shifts the moral weight from beneficence to autonomy. Number 9. What is informed consent? Informed consent is a doctrine that ensures that patient autonomy is respected. Informed consent is a really, really important concept in medical ethics, so much so that we'll be talking about it in great detail in the next chapter. But suffice it to say that traditionally, physicians and other healthcare workers really saw themselves as having full power to be paternalistic, and most patients would allow it. It just kind of used to be that whatever a doctor said or a healthcare professional said, you just kind of took their word for it. They were the authority. And the patient's autonomy and choices had a lot less moral and social weight in the physician-patient relationship. But informed consent now ensures that the autonomy principle has an important place in the practice of medicine. Number 8. What is the Elizabeth Bouvia case? The Elizabeth Bouvia case was a groundbreaking case when it comes to the conflict between paternalism and autonomy. Bouvia had cerebral palsy and arthritis, and in her mid-20s, her family just dropped her off at a hospital because they refused to provide her with the care that she needed. Bouvia wanted to commit suicide through starvation. Since she couldn't feed herself, she needed feeding tubes. So she requested to the hospital that they give her pain meds and keep her clean while she starved to death. And they refused. She sued them. The case went to court, and she lost her case. The judge ruled that force-feeding Bouvia was permissible, since without force-feeding, she would starve to death. And although she had the right to commit suicide, she did not have the right to compel others to be complicit in helping her die. Remember this because we'll come back to these kinds of issues when we get to the chapter on euthanasia. Bouvia appealed her case, and in 1986, she won. So this is a groundbreaking case where the California Court of Appeals rules that any autonomous person who is competent to decide has both the moral and legal right to refuse treatment, even if that treatment would be life-saving. And thus the tides turned from the heavy-handed paternalism of physicians making decisions for patients, and the requirement of respecting patient autonomy becomes a priority. Number 7. Do parents have the right to refuse treatment for their children based on religious beliefs? Although the Bouvia case, along with other cases, set the precedence of patient autonomy outweighing medical paternalism, it's not clear whether that applies in the case of parents making decisions for their children based on their own religious beliefs in the name of religious freedom. We typically take parents to be not only caretakers, but legal representatives for their children. However, do parents have a right to choose for their children, even if that choice causes harm to children? In the Prince v. Commonwealth of Massachusetts in a 1944 case, which is actually well before the Bouvia case, the judge ruled that parents might be free to become martyrs themselves, but it doesn't follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children. That is, although individuals should be allowed to refuse treatment, competent individuals should not be allowed to choose treatments for their children if their children could be harmed by those choices. Number 6. What is futile treatment? Futile treatment is treatment that a patient or their family requests that the physician believes to be completely useless. And physicians have the right to refuse futile treatment so long as there's evidence that the treatment will have no benefits for the patient. Number 5, how would utilitarians handle the issue of paternalism? Although utilitarian theorists vary and they all don't have precisely the same arguments, generally a utilitarian would support paternalistic actions so long as the outcome of the paternalism is what brings about the overall good. Utilitarianism then might justify overriding a patient's right to refuse treatment. If refusing that treatment doesn't bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people involved, then according to the greatest happiness principle, it would not be moral for that patient to refuse treatment, even if it's what they wanted for themselves. Number 4, how might Kantians handle the issue of paternalism? Kantian deontology would strongly reject the idea of at least strong paternalism. The humanity formula, the second formulation of the categorical imperative, explicitly affirms the importance of the respect for the individual autonomy of persons. So long as someone is an autonomous, competent being, we must respect their choices and decisions. So for a Kantian, utility or paternalism, even in the name of beneficence, would never overrule autonomy. So you can see how Kantianism and utilitarianism, two of the primary moral theories, take completely different views on and result in completely different moral judgments on issues of paternalism in medicine. The number 3 thing you should know after reading the introduction to Chapter 3 is what issues Case 1 brings out. In Case 1, the parents of a 2-year-old refused to take him to the hospital when he became sick because of their religious beliefs. They relied solely on prayer, and the 2-year-old died. So, although the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, the question here is how we deal with the conflict between the parents' religious beliefs and their neglect of a child to the point where it dies because they refuse medical treatment, claiming religious freedom. The number 2 thing you should understand after reading the Chapter 3 introduction is what issues Case 2 brings out. There was a program in South Carolina where pregnant women were being tested for drug use without their consent. And the Supreme Court ruled here that even though the program was intended to help both the women and their unborn children, testing the women without their consent violates the Constitution. Furthermore, even if the intent was to help women, as Justice Stevens points out, the results of those tests were given to law enforcement. And so it was clear that the immediate objective was not necessarily to help remediate a woman's drug addiction, but to generate information for law enforcement. So this case brings up some interesting issues regarding beneficence and particularly the care of unborn children and how that clashes with a patient's right to autonomy and informed consent. And the number 1 thing you should know about the Chapter 3 introduction is what issues does Case 3 bring about? In Case 3, you have the situation of baby Emilio Gonzalez, who was a 17-month-old deaf, blind, and terminally ill child. And in this case, the parents were asking for treatments that the physicians considered to be futile. So the question here is whether or not physicians have a right to refuse treatment if that treatment might prolong life, even though that treatment has no medical benefits. We're going to take a look now at Dworkin's argument on paternalism, and we'll look at the top 8 things you should know from this essay. Number 8, what is Dworkin's thesis? That is, what is his main claim? As we go through these chapters and look at some of the arguments in the additional readings, you should always be looking for the author's main point. What is their thesis? What is the conclusion? What is the main point that they are using the rest of the essay to argue for? Dworkin's thesis, his conclusion in this essay, is that some forms of state paternalism are permissible as long as they are justified. Number 7. What is Mill's principle? Dworkin talks about Mill's principle from On Liberty. And Mill argues that, first of all, someone's autonomy can only be undermined to protect others from harm. And second of all, someone's autonomy cannot be interfered with even if other people would deem it wise or right to do so. Remember that paternalism is the interference with a person's liberty of action, their choice, justified by reasons that it's in their best interest. That is, that it's exclusively to the welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, or values of the person who is being coerced into making a different choice. Part of being in a society means that we set up rules. There are things that you can't do. That is, there are instances where your choices are limited, where someone else is going to tell you you can't do something. For example, there are laws in some states requiring motorcyclists to wear motorcycle helmets. That's an infringement on autonomy. There are laws regulating sexual conduct and sexuality. We may or may not think there's good reason for these laws. There are also laws against dueling. There are laws preventing swimming at beaches without lifeguards. There are laws about putting fluoride or lead, think Flint, in the city water supply. There are laws banning smoking in public buildings. For better or worse, there are some instances of paternalism that are part of living in any society. Number 5. What's the difference between pure and impure cases of paternalism? Although there are lots of different examples of state-sanctioned paternalism, and again, some for better or worse, Dworkin distinguishes between pure cases of paternalism and impure cases of paternalism. Pure cases of paternalism are cases where the group of persons whose freedom is being restricted, whose choices are being overridden, are the same persons whose interests are being served by the restriction. So, we're overriding someone's choice because it's in their best interest. Whereas impure cases of paternalism are cases of paternalism where the group of persons whose freedom is restricted is not the same group of persons whose interests are served by the restriction. That is, in impure cases of paternalism, we override someone's choice in order to keep others from being harmed. Mill agrees with impure cases of paternalism. He says there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, we have to limit people's actions. They can't just do whatever they want. They're not allowed, for example, to steal other people's things or murder other people, because this harms other people. And certainly Mill agrees with this, and Dworkin agrees with this. Pretty much everybody agrees with this. Whereas in pure cases of paternalism, Mill disagrees with this. Despite Mill's being a utilitarian, he also believes in liberty. He believes that people are free to make choices about their own lives. So Mill rejects pure cases of paternalism. Dworkin, on the other hand, is going to argue that pure cases of paternalism are legitimate in some cases. So long as the reasons for pure paternalism are justified, it can be morally permissible. Number 4. What is the difference between a recognized good and an unrecognized good? A recognized good is basically something that someone recognizes as being good. It's a benefit that can result from paternalism that the agent does in fact recognize as being a good thing, a positive, desirable thing. However, the agent might place more value on a competing good. For example, we said that there are state laws about motorcycle helmets in some states. Personally, I drive a motorcycle, and I don't prefer to wear a helmet. I do recognize that wearing a helmet is a good, in the sense that were I to get in an accident, it would protect my brain stuffs. It may even save my life. However, I also recognize that the small risk of my being in an accident, since I'm not a speed racer, I like to cruise comfortably and safely, that small risk doesn't outweigh the pleasure I get from cruising down the road with the sun on my face and the wind through my hair, with full visibility, without the limitations of a motorcycle helmet. So this is an example of a good that I might recognize, yet at the same time exercise my autonomy and choose not to wear a motorcycle helmet. An unrecognized good, on the other hand, is a benefit that could result from paternalism that the agent does not in fact recognize as a good, even though most people do. So we talked a little bit in the chapter introduction about religious freedom. So here's an example. Based on religious beliefs, refusing to give your children vaccines or refusing blood transfusions. You may not recognize these as a good because you may believe that your praying or your religious beliefs are in fact a good, and those will keep you healthy, and that vaccines and blood transfusions are bad, are evil, are morally wrong. This is different than making the choice not to vaccinate your children or have a blood transfusion, because even though it's good, there's a competing good, but rather because you don't recognize that as a good at all. Number 3, according to Dworkin, what is Mill's argument against paternalism? We said a moment ago that although Dworkin is arguing that there are some cases where paternalism is justified, Mill argues that pure paternalism is never justified. Here's Mill's argument. Mill argues that restraints on freedom are wrong, so the burden of proof is on those who propose restraint. Moreover, appeal to the protection of others is not relevant in cases of pure paternalism, and reasons for the individual's own good, happiness, or interests are required. We cannot coerce free individuals. To do so involves evil that outweighs the good. Therefore, the promotion of an individual's own interests is not sufficient warrant to use compulsion. So if we look at this more closely, we can see the importance of the fourth premise. We cannot coerce free individuals. To do so involves evil that outweighs the good. This fourth premise results from Mill's additional argument that individuals themselves are in the best position to know what is good for them. But do individuals always in fact know what is best for them? Is it possible that someone else might have a better idea of what is in a person's best interests? Utilitarian Fitzjames Stevens objects to Mill's arguments on the grounds that there's no proof that, quote, adults are so well acquainted with their own interests and so much disposed to pursue them that no compulsion or restraint put upon them by any others for the purpose of promoting their interests can really promote them. So, suffice it to say that Stevens is arguing that Mill is wrong about the fact that we're always in a position to know best about what is in our best interest. So let's look at this argument in a different way. Is it moral for a person to choose to become enslaved? That is, can a person choose to give up their capacity for choice? According to Mill, the principle of freedom cannot require that one is free to not be free. But Dworkin suggests a more narrow principle, that paternalism is justified only if that overriding of someone's choice actually opens up a wider range of freedoms for that person. Overriding someone's choice in order to preserve their future autonomy is a justified use of paternalism. Number 2, what is future-oriented consent? Future-oriented consent is the idea that interfering with someone's choices, for children or for adults who lack full autonomy, amounts to doing what they would do if they were fully autonomous and capable of making good rational decisions in their own best interest. In fact, Dworkin argues that, look, we often do take out social insurance policies. We know that there are limits to our abilities to be rational and knowledgeable about our own choices. So for Dworkin, what we need to do is to develop a clear idea of when people would in fact limit their freedom for their own good to enhance their own future autonomy. It's clear, he thinks, that people want to have certain things like health, education, because these things promote our own interests. So these kinds of goods are the kinds of goods that should be promoted even if they're not recognized goods at a given moment by some particular person. And finally, the number one thing you should know about Dworkin's argument on paternalism is whether or not there are any caveats to Dworkin's claim that pure paternalism is sometimes justified. Dworkin argues that paternalism should further freedom. Thus, there must be a clear burden of proof demonstrating the nature of the consequences to be avoided or achieved through paternalism. Also, when overriding someone else's choices, the least restrictive alternative should be chosen, even if it is expensive or inconvenient. Phew, that was a long one. But we made it. These are the top things you should know about the introduction to Chapter 3 and Dworkin's argument on paternalism. For Wednesday, we've got just one reading, and we'll see how another author argues about paternalism in medicine.